right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's discussion about Afghanistan and engagement with the Taliban. For those who might be joining for the first time, I'll give my quick spiel about Network 2020. We're a New York City-based nonprofit, and we provide access to leading thinkers and doers in the international affairs space for our audiences in New York and also around the world. And our aim is really to create more nuanced conversations about global affairs. So just a little background, it has been nearly 3 years, it's hard to believe, since the United States withdrew its forces from Afghanistan, bringing an ending to 2 decades of war that really had, I think, very little closure to a chapter of history that was filled with, I think, a lot of hope, loss, and frustration, and both Masuda and Carter can speak to that. And 3 years later, the Taliban must govern a country that is largely isolated from global financial and support structures. And as usual, people are caught in the middle. And so I think today what we really want to do is dig into what that looks like. And I'm very pleased to welcome back two people that have previously spoken with Network 2020. We have Dr. Carter Malkasian. He is an historian and the chair of the Defense Analysis Department at the Naval Postgraduate School and is a former advisor to American military commanders in Afghanistan. He has his doctorate in military history and also speaks Pashto. And I'm also very pleased to welcome back Masuda Sultan. She is the CEO of Symbio Investment and has worked on Afghan issues for over 2 decades as a women's rights activist and as an entrepreneur bringing foreign investment, as well as an advisor to the Afghan government. So welcome back, both of you. I'd like to start where I usually like to start, which is with some scene setting. And Carter, could you please just kindly start us off with a broad overview of the political state of Afghanistan 3 years after the takeover of the Taliban? And could you also help us understand how the Taliban has transformed itself from this former governing guerrilla extremist group into a governing power of an entire country? And to what degree has this transformation been effective?
Yeah, absolutely, Courtney. And thank you for having me today. It's a real pleasure. And it's good to be able to speak to your audience again. Um, so when we think about the broader situation in Afghanistan today and the Taliban's rule, I think one of the main questions that comes up to me is the Civil War over? Is the Civil War that started in 1979 and went for 40 years, has it finally ended? And when you look at the calm that exists in a lot of the country, that's not to say there isn't some suppression and oppression going on. And there are still terrorist attacks that happen. But if you look at the overall calm, it has to make you wonder: has that period of difficulty and hardship, has it ended? Now, we really can't say that it has quite yet, because we've had previous pauses in the civil war that was happening in Afghanistan. And you might say our early years, and we were there, were also a pause. But you have to wonder right now, is it more likely? So if you look at what the Taliban have done, they have been able to exert some kind of calm in the country. Part of that is the people were very tired. They're tired of war, and so we didn't see a new resistance movement start going, and we didn't see international support for another resistance movement get going. So part of it's that. A part of the other reason the Taliban are able to have this kind of order, perhaps for lack of a better term, is how they've structured themselves and how they've thought about themselves over the long period. We have to understand that this actually isn't the Taliban's first time governing. The Taliban did govern previously, and they would often talk about themselves. And when we met with them at various times, is no, we have a government, we know how to govern. We are the government in exile. So they think about themselves in that way. And the form of government that the Taliban had at the time, and appears to have today, is one in which there is a degree of centralization, in which the governors know that they're reporting upward, in which the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Interior know they're reporting to Haybatullah, the Emir. And there's an expectation that people are going to follow what Haybatullah has to say. And that degree of order and the lack of infighting stands a little bit in contrast to the government that we supported over time, when there was much more difficulty between the two sides. Why is it that they're able to have this kind of coherence that exists? Well, for one thing, they remember the Civil War in the 90s very well. And many of the people who are in charge today were around then. And they remember the anarchy that happened, and they remember how the other warlords, how they treated people, and how that resulted in great difficulties for the Afghan people. So that's left them with an understanding that if we start fighting with each other, things are going to get bad. If we go too far, if Sirajuddin Haqqani feels like I need to take too much power, if Mullah Omar's son, if Yaqub feels like he needs to take too much power, they understand that there's real negative repercussions for this. And in their history throughout our war, there were also times where there were friction that they managed to overcome with their transitions. So there's a history there. Part of it also, there was the kind of emphasis on Islam that they have and the kind of student-teacher relationships that existed between these Taliban leaders over time. And those kind of relationships stress a certain kind of obedience, a bayat, the allegiance to the leader. And that is a little bit different between how the tribes run themselves or even our government, the government that we supported, ran itself. So that creates a greater degree of cohesion with the Taliban. Now, as I say these things, I do recognize that there is, conflict and friction within the Taliban. There are power struggles that go on. We know that within the different ministries that there are some people who are supporting Haybatullah. There are some people who are strictly in support of Sirajuddin. We've heard about various clashes that happen here and there. So we know that's there. I've heard other stories about there's various Taliban who are less educated, and they're upset because right now they can't be a district governor. They can't go and become a provincial governor. They're not going to get a government job, and so they're looking for money right now. So those are various issues that are there. When I think about the instability and the problems that happen in the countryside and elsewhere in Afghanistan, to me, it looks a lot more like the issues that are there are it's less that the Taliban are taking it out against former government members. Now, former government members are not going to be able to work in the new government. I think that's very clear. But it's less that they're trying to throw them in jail, they're trying to torture them or kill them or anything like that. It's more that within Afghanistan, every person who lives somewhere, every person who has a farm, every person who's in a village, they can have their own communal strife that's happening. They can have their own issues over land that are happening. So a major problem for the people who worked with us, I think, is perhaps less the government than it is their own neighbors in their own community who remember that these people work with the government, but now that government is out, now the Taliban are in, and that gives room for competition to happen. And I don't want to talk too long. The last thing I think I'll talk about is the economy in time. So when we think about the Taliban and how long they could last in power if the civil war is truly over, the main threat to the economy, the main threat to the Taliban is the economy, and it is time. It's that the hardship that the Afghans are going under right now will eventually make some of them want to stand up, or make some of them maybe want to take up arms or oppose the government. The drought that's been experienced there for several years is a dramatic issue for Afghanistan. It reduces the amount of crops that can be produced. The restriction on poppy is a dramatic action the Taliban have taken. It also speaks to their cohesion and order as an organization that they can affect that. But how long they'll be able to do that is a question. And the longer they press that, it is possible, I'm not saying it's for certain, it is possible that they will then have more internal issues there. And so the economy is an issue there. And I mentioned time there too, because it goes back to the memory of the Taliban leaders who experienced the civil war and experienced hardship. How long will that memory last? How long will that feeling last? Or will political competition take over? And those are kind of the threats I would see to the Taliban's political situation over the long term. So let me stop there.
That was great. Thank you. Really terrific introduction to the situation right now. Masuda, turning to you, and this actually, I think, picks up well where Carter left off. Looking at the situation of people in Afghanistan, we keep hearing about a massive humanitarian crisis, everything from food and water shortages, drought, to healthcare. So to what degree is this a consequence of the war, just remnants of the war, and to what degree is it a consequence of ineffective Taliban governance? And based on your experience with humanitarian efforts, can either of these or any of the other causes be solved in the near future?
Thank you. Well, first of all, Courtney, it's great to be with you and again with Dr. Malkasian. It's difficult for a nation perpetually at war to prosper. I mean, Afghanistan was never really rich, but it's had 43 years of war with two global superpowers and brutal civil war. And as mentioned, potentially one that is not done. And I'll get into Taliban governance. The UN says that there's 23 million people, more than half the population of 40 million, who face food insecurity. So it's important to remember that before the collapse, donors were funding 80% of Afghanistan's budget, and that essentially stopped overnight, right? So that included security, education, and health, most public services, development funding. There's a total of around $8 billion a year, $8 billion a year. You can say this funding was a direct consequence of the war, so it was sort of a bubble. Afghanistan went into a shutdown mode as the focus was evacuations. So a lot of NGOs evacuated their staff or just stopped their activities. So the number of Afghans that were in need shot up, and the economy at the same time crashed. So you had this snowball effect of the shock to the country, paralysis on the part of donors on which it relied, and then on top of it, already bad situation because what had been brewing prior, it was the aftermath of COVID. There was already increasing poverty due to conflict and mismanagement and corruption by the previous government. So that's what the Taliban inherited. To the credit of the US, when we rang the alarm bells about hunger and malnutrition, and we all saw the images of Afghan women lining up at the bakeries in the freezing cold just for a piece of bread. The US stepped in and funded the WFP in a big way and staved off a famine. But the funding has been decreasing over time, and I'll get more into that. And Afghans have been saying for years now that we don't just want humanitarian assistance. They want something sustainable. They want development assistance. They want jobs. And handouts are not the answer longer term. So the Taliban recognized this problem. Dr. Malkasian mentioned the economy as the big threat to the Taliban. It's the persistent problem of Afghanistan, is getting this economy to function on its own without so much of international aid. And the Taliban have been screaming at the top of their lungs about these issues, the banking issues, the chilling effects of the sanctions on the economy. They've been very focused on the economy. They've been building infrastructure projects like dams. They've even been encouraging women's business. But it's clear that they're unable to provide for the population without the help of the international community, and at least without the cutoff of the restrictions on the economy. So the Taliban have really made it worse in many ways because they've been issuing decree after decree, undermining women, their right to education, their right to work, and public life, banning women from working for the UN, going into the office for aid agencies, so they often have to work from home, except for like health and some exceptions in education. And it's a big problem because 80% of the people in need are women and children, and it's getting increasingly difficult to get to them. So what the Taliban need to do is address this by engaging with the US and the EU, Western donors, to deal with this larger economic question. And then that's also tied into the human rights, women's rights, and political questions, the potential about a political settlement, in order to kind of get Afghanistan back into the international system, especially the international financial system. All of this is going to take a long time. I mean, it's really hard to say when this will start working again. And the question is somewhat connected to the other question about the emir. Many people say that the emir is unwilling to budge on some of these issues, and he's living in relative isolation in Kandahar. So to what extent we'll be able to make progress on that depends on the emir himself.
Thank you. That's a great segue into the next question for Carter, which is really how effective is engaging with the Taliban to accomplish even limited priorities? I mean, Masuda brought up the whole host of issues that really need to be resolved, but then there's ones that are of mutual interest, like curtailing ISIS-K. So based on your experience with the Taliban, what do we need to know about negotiations with them? And Masuda brought up the fact that the emir is an important piece. And do other countries such as China have similar or different views on this?
So Masuda brought up a great point about Heybatullah. And Heybatullah is ruling in somewhat of a Mullah Omar fashion, where you don't see him very much. There are speeches that he's given and such that you can read and listen to. But he's kept himself in Kandahar, just like Mullah Omar did. And he runs himself from becoming a very religious stature. And in some ways, it's a little bit it seems a little bit like Iran as well. But you also have to remember there's some key things about Heybatullah as well, is that he is someone who had supported the suicide bombing. He did issue fatwas, edicts that said that this was something that could be done. On his son, it's a little bit I think it's I believe it is an adopted son, but his adopted son was a suicide bomber, or at least was publicized that way. So those are pretty strong things to do that make one look all the more hard line on issues and makes negotiations difficult. Now, at this point, all our negotiations with the Taliban, at least that I think that we're all aware of, have not been via Heybatullah. They've been through the other members of the Taliban. And so that's how negotiations have moved forward. Now, talking more specifically about negotiations, I mean, I tend to think that there is value in having a relationship with the Taliban. I tend to think that having an embassy in a country is a good thing. Embassies help build understanding. Embassies help us, if there's a crisis, help us deal with the crisis. And I think that we suffer there's a lot of problems and friction you encounter when you don't have an embassy there. Also, I mean, humanitarian assistance, that seems to be a U.S. interest. It doesn't seem to have any reasons that we wouldn't want to provide that to Afghanistan, and you might even extend that into some economic interest. The very big issue here, however, it comes back to how we kind of think about the war and how we remember the war, and it comes to U.S. domestic politics. That it's hard to see which administration is going to decide that they want to engage in a major effort to talk to the Taliban. Opening an embassy will attract media attention. Large amounts of economic aid will attract congressional and media attention. It will reopen the wound of what happened in Afghanistan. It will open either side to being weak to the Taliban or weak against terrorism. It will open the Democrats to what happened in 2021. And I'm not trying to point any blame, but there will be people will make accusations on that. So domestically, it's hard to see how we would go forward with a major effort with the Taliban. Now, thinking a little bit more internationally beyond the United States, I think some things to think about when dealing with the Taliban. One thing is that I think an embassy, humanitarian assistance, economic assistance, those are good things, but we should also understand we're not going to get much of a quid pro quo here. We've had enough engagement on the women's issue now for 3 years to have some skepticism about what we're going to get from the Taliban. On the terrorist issue, the Taliban have said for a long time, we're not going to let there be attacks out of Afghanistan on another country, but they've never said we're not going to, that we won't give some kind of comfort or allow some people to live in the country. They've never said that they're going to break ties with Al-Qaeda. And if they weren't going to break ties with Al-Qaeda when we had troops in the country, I think it's a safe bet. They're unlikely to do so. They're unlikely to budge now. They haven't budged much on an inclusive government. And allowing more people to come in, allowing civil society to come in, allowing people who are part of the former government to come back in. And like I mentioned before, that's not really part of their governing model. And I remember very specifically in negotiations with the Taliban, off to the sides, they'd say, hey, look, that was their time. Now it's going to be our time. When they were in charge, we weren't a part of it, and it's going to be our time, and they're not going to be a part of it. So I think we have good reasons there's benefits that can be gotten from engagement, but we just have to be very sober about there's benefits that can be gotten, but we have to realize that they only go to a certain point. There's only so much that we can get out of it. And the Taliban have some things that they want, they're not going to budge on, and we have limitations on how far we can get. And that's what makes engagement difficult. China and Russia, they definitely have a different viewpoint on this. They have greater reasons to engage with Afghanistan for economic reasons, plus Russia has political reasons and security reasons to be engaged with Afghanistan. And I would expect that each side could diverge on that in the future. And I wouldn't be surprised if we saw certain countries saying, hey, we do want to recognize the Taliban, or we do want to, behind the scenes, have a greater relationship with them.
Thank you. Do you see a scenario in which over time, if the Taliban stays in place, assuming that it does, that greater international recognition would lead to some sort of bifurcation within the larger system of countries that would recognize the Taliban and ones that won't, or would that apply some pressure, do you think, to the United States?
I think in the near term it wouldn't apply. So yes, I could see that bifurcation happening. Although I would also think the more likely thing is that Russia and China will just work with them behind the scenes, and they'll avoid having the kind of issues in the United Nations Security Council and the General Assembly that would be attached to recognizing the Taliban, and they'll just try to work agreements and provide assistance and money that doesn't require that kind of recognition. It could put that them doing that could put some degree of pressure on the United States, but I think our domestic political concerns would outmatch that. So we'd probably just bite our tongues and deal with it. Over time, it's harder to say. What would happen 10 years from now, 5 years from now is harder to say.
Thank you. Masuda, the Taliban rule obviously brought a lot of changes, labor laws, the security situation, and the banking system, among many others. So how has the financial situation changed since the Taliban came back to power? And how is the country really managing economically when it is cut off from much of the rest of the world?
And not so well. So I mentioned earlier that Afghanistan experienced this shock. It lost about 30% of GDP just in the first couple of years. And the problem is that when the Taliban came to power initially, this go around, you had a number of individuals under US and UN sanctions who came into control, including, for example, like in the central bank, even though the law of the central bank itself hasn't changed. But the freezing of the central bank assets, the freezing of the private banks' assets meant that people's lives were turned upside down. And the country is still largely cut off from the international financial system. Although it's something that the US Treasury has attempted to address with something called the General License Number 20, meaning that it's technically possible to do humanitarian aid transactions and even trade. And even, for example, paying customs duties to the Taliban is allowed. But practically, there's still a big problem in banking, and some of the largest NGOs are still having trouble making transfers for things like paying employees, et cetera, really for important life-saving work. Most of the banks are unwilling to engage in these transfers involving Afghanistan. They will claim Afghanistan is under sanctions, even though Afghanistan is not technically under sanctions, but they're unwilling to take the legal risks. And then there's also the reputational risk of dealing with what is essentially a pariah state. Taliban macroeconomic management has surprisingly been better than expected. For example, they've managed to stabilize the exchange rate. Inflation is under control. They're pretty good at revenue collection, and there's rising exports. But there's still little hope that there'll be, for example, FDI coming in, even with the improved security. There's little hope that the economy will grow or even keep pace with population growth. You have a private sector that is just barely surviving, far from thriving. As the Taliban have been attempting to raise revenues, they've been squeezing an already shrinking base of the private sector. And so people have been closing down their businesses. The jobs have been lost. And so there's not a lot of hope for the private sector that things will get better. But for example, the Afghan American Chamber of Commerce did conduct a visit to Afghanistan almost a year ago, and there are other trips. People are trying to help, but it's very, very difficult given the political status of the country and the disconnection from the international community.
As a quick follow-up, are there areas of the economy that seem to be able to get a little bit more traction than others?
Yeah, so agriculture is growing. Agricultural exports are growing, which is very good. There have been a lot of problems at the border with Pakistan. There's been a lot of shutdowns when it's time to sort of export during spring, the agricultural products. So it's been really hard on farmers, but generally that's been one kind of relative bright spot.
Great, thank you. Carter, kind of a big picture question. After 2 decades of war and then the 3 subsequent years of Taliban rule, what do you think the legacy of these years are and will be? And what needs to be done to really to reconcile all that those years brought with it, from the bad to the good, with where we are today? And it feels like Afghanistan has fallen off, at least in the US, just the collective attention. And I wonder if there's a risk with that.
On So I'd say that what we're kind of going through in the US at least is an enforced exercise in forgetting. Um, I think that people don't want to remember how the war ended. As we were talking right before this started, the war was often like forgotten while it was actually being waged as well. On But it is a war that we were involved in, that the international community and the Afghans were involved in for 20, if not 40 years. It was a war that we were involved in for over 20 years. It was a war in which thousands of Americans lost their lives in, and more than that were wounded. Um, so it is something that we shouldn't readily forget. And as important as Ukraine and Gaza is right now, on the Afghan experience is its own experience. And having spent time on the ground there in places, I do have a certain feeling that when U.S. troops are engaged on the ground, that is something that we don't want to forget what happened there. We don't want to forget what that experience was. So when I think about how we remember the war, I think there's 3 things I'd like to call out in terms of how we remember it. And perhaps the most important is that, for most of the time we were there, whether we were misguided or not, we really believed there was a terrorist threat. Our leadership believed that there was a terrorist threat. The soldiers on the ground who were engaged, they believed that there was a terrorist threat. We were looking carefully for, where was Al Qaeda, what Taliban connections there were to Al Qaeda at the time. And given the recent attacks at the time that had happened in the United States, there was a feeling you just couldn't let that go. That you had a responsibility to the people, to the American people, to be taking care of this problem. And I mean, there was an actual threat. I'm not saying it wasn't overblown, and that it lasted. It was really lasted as long as we stayed there. But for a time, there was. And I think that's why a whole lot of people who were there, and they were trying to, but protect Americans, protect Western Europeans, protect the rest of the world. And that should be remembered. We should also remember that there was a real improvement for Afghans in certain respects when we were there. There was an improvement in health. There was an improvement in education. As Masuda just talked about, there was an improvement in the economy. There was an improvement in women's rights. Even things that we don't that we think that weren't managed well, like roads and such, like the ring road around Afghanistan, it's hard to think of a better way to get people to healthcare. And whether the road lasted well, whether it had potholes in it 5 years afterwards, it still improved the lives of a whole lot of Afghans who were there. Now the other thing we have to think about, though, I think, is we remember the war, that the war did go on for a long time, and it was a civil war, and it did harm a lot of people in that. So we're there to protect ourselves against a terrorist threat. You have to weigh that against what harm may have come to the rest of the Afghans. And that particular part of the legacy, we don't have a great answer to right now, because just as Masuda is going over, you can see that while there might be safety for more people, there is also hardship going on right now for the Afghans. So it's hard to readily say that life under the Taliban is better than it was as from life under Hamid Karzai or Ashraf Ghani. But we have to keep in mind that our presence there did bring conflict. Our presence there brought a resistance to occupation. Our presence inspired people to fight. So for the people whose lives were improved in health and education and women's rights, there's other people who lost their lives, either because of our bombs going in the wrong direction, and IED in the wrong place, or just simply the violence that happens with civil war. And that's something that, as we look at other conflicts we're going to be in, other times when we're worried about our national interests, that you should weigh the national interest against what can be happening to the people in there, in those places. So, those are some of the things that I think about when we talk about how we remember the war, how we remember it now 3 years out, and hopefully how we continue to remember it over time.
Thank you. I'll turn to the Q&A box in a moment. I just want to get in one more question. If you're listening and would like to ask a question, please put it into the Q&A box and I will get to as many as I can. Masuda, you've worked for decades in a number of different capacities as a humanitarian advocate for the Afghan people, particularly women. Now that the Taliban has cemented control over the country, what can such advocates do to help the situation of Afghan women, if they're so inclined? And how does one balance the issue of human rights with the need for humanitarian relief? And sort of the final in this constellation of questions, is going around the Taliban directly to the Afghan people possible?
Well, I think Dr. Malkasian pointed to something really, really important, which is that the U.S. um, uh, essentially funded and managed, along with the Afghan people, this huge improvement in the health and education of Afghan women and Afghan people. I mean, that is, I think, for all of the misery that the U.S. gets for that war. I think if we look at the brightest spot of our intervention, it is clearly on the issue of Afghan girls' education, and the improvements in health, and that's something we should remind people about, and it's something we should continue to work on because. Uh, i- 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 the other side of that, as mentioned, was that a lot of people had to die because of this war. And we always said that the war wasn't against the Afghan people, that we didn't have a problem with the Afghan people. And so I think continuing the legacy that we have built, we got women's literacy to 25%, which was more than doubling of what it was before. And it's still at one of the lowest in the region, don't get me wrong, but continuing to invest in that kind of thing for a very low cost, mind you. The war cost us $50 billion a year. We're now spending $1 billion a year, and that's already being cut. There are people in Washington saying, why should we fund Afghanistan, for example? There's other people saying that, well, this money is going to the Taliban, as if all of this aid money is going directly to the pocket of the Taliban, even though it's going to the WFP, to UNICEF, and to other very important programs. So Afghanistan is at risk of being sort of attacked on the one side, the Afghan people attacked on the one side by having, I mean, I say attacked, but what I mean is their aid cut off, right? And that's their lifeline. So there are people actively working to cut that off. And then on the other side, they have the Taliban, who are, with Afghan women, restricting them in all of these huge ways. I mean, it's considered, Human Rights Watch calls it the largest human rights crisis in the world. So Afghan women are sort of stuck between these two. There's just today, there's been 10 international NGOs like Save the Children and others who have rung the alarm bell, saying that the reduction in funding is really a problem. Donors seem to want to turn their back on Afghanistan for many reasons, but they're now saying that because of the Taliban's restrictions, and their moral objection to the way women are being treated, that they're going to cut off these aid programs. But the reality is that they're just punishing Afghan women by cutting off these programs, and that it's still possible to get aid to Afghan women. There are so many programs run, especially with smaller NGOs. I work with one, for example. We do food drops to women who are former survivors of domestic violence, or currently dealing with domestic violence. We run safe circles. Some of them are run online or through mobile phones, so that they have a place to interact with other women, because a lot of them are restricted to being at home because they can't meet publicly. They used to meet in the office, in the NGO office, but they're no longer allowed to do that. So there are still ways to get to Afghan women. The other thing to remember is, for example, at the primary education level, there's still millions of girls in school. So we could potentially be working at that level. There are programs working at the higher levels as well. For example, online university. I was just speaking with someone yesterday who said he enrolled his daughter in an online university in Kabul. So those kinds of things are possible, and should continue. what we should not do is isolate the Afghan population, because that is how we will get a repeat of what happened in the 1990s. And we've been trying to ring the alarm bell on this, which is even if we're frustrated with Afghanistan, even if we don't like talking to the Taliban, even if we feel like it's not accomplishing the things that we want to accomplish, this is a long-term exercise, this country. We don't want to repeat the same mistakes of the 1990s. We don't want to turn our back and then find out that something has happened that is affecting us. We need to keep a relationship with these people. We need to keep a relationship with this country. And as Dr. Malkasian said, I've also agree with him that, we should reopen our embassy in Afghanistan. We should have a presence there for our own interests as well as for the interests of the Afghan people. But in terms of U.S. interests, the thing to do is to not repeat the isolation of the country that we had in the 1990s.
Thank you. Really appreciate all the perspectives that both of you brought. I'm turning to the Q&A box now, and I will start with you, Masuda. Actually, we have a question here, and again, feel free either of you to jump in on any question. But I'll start with you, Masuda. The questioner asks, are there any serious mutual listening programs between the Taliban and Americans that might get to any sort of win-win in the future?
Serious listening program. So there isn't as much engagement as there needs to be. The US is meeting with the Taliban, but very infrequently, although they are meeting in Doha. For example, the Charge d'Affaires is meeting with the representative of the Taliban in Doha. But in terms of sustained engagement on issues, that's just beginning to happen. So the UN just had their Doha 3 meeting, which was with the Taliban. It was a bit controversial because Afghan civil society wasn't in the main meeting, but there was a separate meeting for Afghan civil society. The UN has really a big challenge in terms of getting the Taliban to accept the other Afghans, and the other Afghans were not accepting the Taliban previously. So as Dr. Malkasian mentioned, it's sort of like giving it back to them. But we're all urging the Taliban to engage. And the irony of this is that the Taliban are saying, for example, today, Haqqani, in the anniversary event, said, we don't want accountability with the US. We want to talk to the US. They've been sending signal after signal after signal that they want to engage with the US, that it's time for peace, it's time for better relations. And the US has for political reasons domestically, has had some reservations and has been doing it in a very limited way, mostly talking about, making sure to broadcast about Afghan women's rights and those kinds of issues. So I think that probably after the elections, we'll see more engagement. But, civilian to civilian engagement, American to Afghan engagement is something that, with the Taliban or with others is something that we're missing here. And it's something that I've been trying to get going, trying to advocate for. The UN is going to try to do this by creating these working groups around the economy and counter narcotics. That's kind of the plan for the next phase of it. But the UN's process has not been going so well. It might be better for NGOs or a track 2 type dialogue to happen.
Thank you. Carter, we have a question here, and they ask, which US allies have the greatest influence with the Taliban, and how or can we use them to help achieve our aims?
So, traditionally, the Norwegians and the Germans have done an excellent job at managing track 2, track 3s and negotiations with the Taliban. And they've been a very useful mediator over time. The UN also, the UN has a variety of friction points there, but I always think it's useful to bring the UN in because it's a venue for neutral voices to provide options. That I think is really valuable. But Norway and others can do the same thing as well, but they all kind of run up against the same problem about how far is the United States willing to go. And I wouldn't say that it would be impossible for the Europeans to figure out if they had an agreement with the United States to figure out a way for them to provide more economic assistance and more opening. That could also be a way to provide some of these conversations like the Masuda is just talking about and an opening to more economic assistance. But it is a little bit difficult at this point to see how that would move forward fast.
Thanks. It seems like the domestic perception situation in the US, and it doesn't extend just to Afghanistan. I think it extends to other issues as well, is one that is a pretty big hurdle.
Yeah, I mean, if you just think about that, if, on the European side, we need to worry about Ukraine and we need to worry about everything that's going on in NATO. And so those kind of issues are going to take precedence over what happens in Afghanistan.
Mhm. Masuda, we have a question here for you. The questioner writes, based on your experience working on humanitarian and women's issues in Afghanistan, do you think it is likely that the Taliban will gradually liberalize over time, either as a result of domestic or international pressure?
It's it's this, what is it, $64,000 question, but I do believe that they will. And the reason I believe that they will is because you have a young Taliban that have been living outside of Afghanistan. Some of them been living in Pakistan. Pakistan is much more liberal than Afghanistan. Women go to school and universities, and they don't cover their faces in most cases. They're exposed to the internet, for example. When we went on both of our trips, every time we met people at the ministries, they would all say that they supported girls' education. And it became a source of controversy because it became obvious that it was coming from the emir, the directive, to keep the older girls' schools closed. Now, I'm not saying that all the other Taliban are very liberal and it's going to be fine. No, what I'm saying is that the younger Taliban are living in a different, there's a generational gap here. And the exposure effect, and that's one of the reasons we want engagement with the international community, is that some of them have been very isolated, fighting in the mountains, fighting in these villages. The more they get exposed to the way the world works, even those that came to Kabul, people report that some of them have been forced to change, just life and being exposed to certain ideas and people. That will gradually change the ones that are not changed. But I believe that the younger generation will definitely have more liberal views than their older ones.
Thank you. Carter, someone writes, how extensive is corruption now compared with corruption under previous regimes?
That's a very good question. So, and just as a warning, questions about the specifics of corruption in Afghanistan or the specifics of like dynastic politics and politicking, it's really hard to know what's happening. But it would appear to be that corruption has reduced since the prior governments, including the governments that we were supporting. Now, part of that is because of the poppy ban. Poppy allows a lot of avenues for corruption to happen because people are collecting a lot of money and they can use that money for payoffs. They can use that money to pocket things. So I think part of it is that. Part of it is also the kind of control the Taliban have over things like the customs and where customs is taken into the border crossings, where previously there were certain key players who had a lot of influence over that, like Abdul Razak or like Muhammad Atta. That appears to be less so. Now, having said that, there's like unknowns for us right now that we want to be careful about what we're talking about in terms of corruption. I don't have a good sense on the amount of religious tax that they're collecting. Now, religious tax is not corruption, but it is a form of taking money. And so the previous governments didn't have that authority to do that. The Taliban do have that authority to do that. While poppy has been drastically reduced, it is still a little bit unclear if some Taliban don't have access to it, or if some armed groups don't have access to it, and what's happening with that money if that is occurring. That's something we don't have a good vision on right now. So there's some blank spots we have there that make it hard that make it possible there's corruption going on that we're unaware of there. But it also goes back to like my argument about order that the Taliban have and their ability to enforce poppy. A lot of this, their ability to control corruption gets to the kind of organization that they put in place within Afghanistan.
Thank you. Masuda, someone writes, what impact will China's Belt and Road Initiative have on Afghanistan's economy and the humanitarian sector?
Well, that's a good question. On the economy, I think it'll be net positive. I mean, any of these regional connectivity projects, and there's been I mean, the Taliban have really been looking to strengthen regional relations and regional connectivity. There's, just a train project coming in from Uzbekistan. There's the efforts to get more use of Gwadar port because of the problems with Pakistan. They have focused on regional connectivity, and I think that that's going to be a good thing. On the humanitarian side, I don't really see it having much of an impact, other than maybe some lift from a better economic situation. But the Chinese are not interested in helping humanitarian efforts, so I don't think it's going to have much of an effect.
Um, this question I'll pose to you, Carter, and then Masuda, I'd like your input as well. The questioner writes, can the panelists address the Taliban suppression of other ethnic groups? So they're saying the Taliban are Pashtuns, and we know that they rule based on Pashtun code of conduct. There's a whole lot in this question, but basically, in what you're seeing now, are you seeing suppression of other ethnic groups?
So the Taliban took great pride in the latter years of the war in talking about how they had reached out to other groups, how they had built support in the Uzbek communities and the Tajik communities. And honestly, a lot of us kind of we thought that that was overblown on the part of the Taliban. But it is the more you read it about it and the more you study it, it does seem to that there was something here, maybe not as great as what the Taliban were talking about. That the Taliban were able to use religious networks and construction of madrasas, sending of ulama into the northern areas, and they got support from that. There was also a degree of antipathy that was growing between Uzbeks and Tajiks and their traditional leaders, that their traditional leaders were not providing with the kind of support that they were used to receiving. The Taliban will readily mention their commanders who are Tajik or Uzbek, and the kind of and the role that they played in those areas in the north and elsewhere. Now that said, today we do know that people in Badakhshan have some trouble with the Taliban. People in Badakhshan aren't happy with the poppy ban. We do know that ISKP, the Islamic State in Khorasan province, the Islamic State, the Daesh element that is in Afghanistan, is active in the northern areas, which suggests that there's some discontent with the Taliban government. We know that the Hazaras still have concerns there. So I think the Taliban always have to overcome this issue of, are they only Pashtuns? Are they something bigger that represents the country as a whole? I think they're very aware of it. I think they are trying to have that representation. And I would honestly say that they've done better in that than they had previously done. But that doesn't remove the fracture that exists there. It doesn't remove the possibility that the Tajik, Uzbek, and Hazaras could get upset enough about how the Taliban are running things to cause a problem for them in the future. That gets back to time.
Masuda, do you have anything to add to that based on your experience?
Yeah, no, I think I think Dr. Malkasian pointed to a lot of really useful historical facts and more recent. I do know that they've been attempting to reach out to a lot of these communities very early on. For example, they went into some of the Hazara areas that had been previously neglected by the previous government in order to show, solidarity with them and a willingness to protect them. Also, for example, I was involved in some of the discussions around the Hindu and Sikh temple around evacuations in that time, and they were attempting to protect those communities. And as they were even evacuating, obviously the Taliban were providing some degree of security on the roads and otherwise. But it's a thorny issue. These ethnic issues are very thorny because there's a long history. There's a lot of animosity. The U.S. Invasion was, primarily conducted in terms of airstrikes and such in the South and the East. It may be no coincidence that the, two major leaders of the Taliban, both Haqqani and the defense minister, Mullah Yaqub, are respectively, from the East and the South. But as mentioned, if they're unable to sort of address these issues in a bigger way, longer term, and there are members of ethnic minority as in the government in some very senior positions. For example, the deputy defense minister the chief of the army, the minister of commerce, for example, is from Panjshir himself. But there's not enough people and there's not enough buy-in from the minority communities, and they're going to have to change that over time and address their grievances.
Thank you. One question, Carter, we have is, where is the Taliban looking in the international community right now? So in this increasingly divisive world order, what trajectory will the Taliban government take, whether that is to a particular global camp or its own unique path, or will it stay isolationist? So in terms of Taliban's foreign policy, what is it that we're looking at?
Well, I actually think what Haqqani said just earlier today or yesterday really fits well with what their foreign policy has been and what their foreign policy I expect to be, which is that we are not going to interfere in the domestic politics of the rest of the world. We're not going to interfere in your country. We do not accept anyone interfering in our country. And that they see that the Taliban is their own state. And they are not interested in spreading violence other places. They're not interested in having other people come into their country. It fits very well with Afghan history and resistance to occupation, etc. They are interested in having economic assistance, and various Afghan governments over time have seen that as extremely important, that you have to have outside countries providing you with help. So they're going to balance this idea that we're not interfering in other places and we don't want you interfering with us. We're not going to get involved in security alliances. We're not taking sides in someone else's conflict with someone else. I'd be extremely surprised if they, even with Pakistan, they haven't stood up and said we're aligning with Pakistan against India. And I'd be very surprised if they ever did that. I think they would prefer to keep themselves in the security sense of things separate and alone. On the economic side, they're going to want to find some countries, as Masuda has been pointing out, that are going to give them assistance. They'll look to the West, they'll look to the United States to do that. They'll also look to China to do the same thing. But as they do that, they are not going to want, I would be surprised if they want to form a security alliance with China or a political alliance with China. They value, one of their foremost values is we are an independent Islamic country. They do not want to be seen as occupied or the puppets of another country, whether that's us or China. So that kind of independence, I'm not even sure I'd call it isolation. It's like we are neutral, we are going to stay neutral, but we are welcoming economic assistance from countries that will help us. I would see those as guiding lights of their foreign policy.
Thank you. Masuda, we have a question here that I do think you addressed, but I think it's worth bringing up again, which is, how sustainable was U.S. help specifically for women if it all fell apart minutes after we left? And so how, to put another spin on it, how do you capture those gains in 20 years, and do they matter?
Well, I mean, sustainability is a big question in the sense of, you're transforming an entire country from, what was, in Kabul in 2001 and 2002. If any of you had seen it, I mean, it was just a complete dead zone. There's been, just physically, just a huge transformation of the country, particularly places like Kabul, big cities. But in terms of the women issue, I think that we've managed huge transformational change in Afghanistan, generational change. Just the fact that all of these young women are now educated is a big deal. And I think that that is, even though the Taliban came in and sort of cut everything off at the legs, so to speak, that doesn't mean that that population hasn't benefited and still is educated, right? So women are able to understand, for example, better about health and hygiene and child rearing. The basic literacy, then once you have that, then allows you to educate yourself in many other subjects, right? And then things culturally, for example, like on television, that there were women that were, singing and dancing and all of that kind of cultural change, that's still in the population. The population became reconnected with the international community, with the world, and has picked up a lot of that in their own lives, right? Even the Olympics sports that just recently happened, the women have participated in that. So there's been a huge generational change. Is that sustainable? I think that it matters to what extent we can keep women educated. And I've been arguing for not just for US supporting education, but even for working with the Taliban, particularly at the primary level, and engaging with them. And then there's things like, for example, community-based education, where it's a school in a tent or a mosque or a home, that's been going on. Because once women have, you need kind of a foundational level of literacy and education before the society can change. And we were, getting there. We were on our way to having, we expected much more in 20 years. We expected a much higher level of literacy, but we were on our way. And so, yes, this is sustainable change, because Afghan women are now demanding education, for example. You see it with the protests, but you also see it literally in every single home across Afghanistan, where girls are complaining to their parents. Even Taliban ministers have talked about their own daughters complaining about the lack of ability to get educated. So the society is transformed. We just have to make sure we don't let them go and get isolated again. That they continue to have that level of support from the outside world, that they can access these services.
Thank you. Yes, and I think, for better or for worse, 20 years is a long time, but it's also, if you're born at the beginning of that 20 years, that's a very formative 2 decades to be under that different type of culture. One final question for both of you. I'll keep it quick. The theme that seems to be emerging is this idea of we can't go back to the 1990s, and we can't keep Afghanistan isolated, and keeping in mind that there are millions of people whose lives are in this situation. What is the one thing that you would most want to see now, to feel like things are moving in a positive direction, that we won't be going back to the 1990s? So I'll start with you, Carter, and then you, Masuda.
I think there's 2 things that are positive. One is that we're not going back to the 1990s, would be a degree of continued stability in Afghanistan, and something done to make sure the economy doesn't go horribly wrong. One of the great challenges that the Taliban are going to have over time is, like I mentioned, time, economy being challenges for them. Well, are they going to be able to adapt to that? Because authoritarian regimes have trouble adapting to it. If they reform too quickly, things fall apart, and you get back to an anarchic kind of environment. If you don't reform, then things will also collapse upon you, because you won't be able to sustain the economics of it. But also the other thing that always comes back, and perhaps it's just my time in government and affairs like this, is the terrorist issue, and where that's going to be in the future. So it's 3 years since the fall, and if you remember some of the assessments we heard in Congress and such, around 2020, 2021, 2020, 2021, was that right now, if the predictions that were being made was that we won't know for 3 years after departure if these terrorist groups have regained capability. The assessment was it's going to take them 3 years to regain capabilities to be able to do something outside of Afghanistan. That was the timeline that thought was necessary for them to provide a threat. So right now, you look at things, and on the one hand, I think you'd say, well, it looks like we're doing okay. We don't hear as much from Afghanistan on this. There is a problem with ISKP. Al-Qaeda is not totally gone, but threats are drastically reduced. On the other hand, we might say it's hard to say, because we don't know as much as we used to know. We don't have information like we used to have. We don't have as many journalists on the ground as we used to have. We're not receiving all this information to have an idea of what the threat is. And then you might point to the attack on Zawahiri, the continued Pakistani Taliban existence in Afghanistan, ISKP's existence, as reasons for us to be concerned. And like I mentioned, we do know that the Taliban haven't actually broken with groups. And you put that into a larger context of what's happening in Gaza, that you might say that, well, could that spark something? could that create a greater terrorist threat? And Sergeant Helkani did mention Gaza, did mention the Palestinians in his speech. So that's a little bit of an unknown known about the future. And to be most comfortable in Afghanistan, to get to your point, would be that we don't see any continuation of terrorist attacks there, because I think that is what we want. Regardless of how this war ended, we're all going to be better off if there is not a resumption of terrorism coming from Afghanistan, whether that's under whoever's rule that is. But I think that's been the question for the past 3 years. I think we're a little bit more comfortable with it now, but I think it's going to continue to be a question for the next 3 years.
Thank you. And Masuda, your thoughts in just a moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just make it really, really quick,
Yeah.
is that we should not forget Afghanistan like we did in the 1990s. We should not repeat that mistake. We should stay engaged with the Afghan population and with their rulers in order to have the best outcome for ourselves and for them.
Well, with that, thank you both. Fascinating conversation, such great insight from the two of you. Really appreciate it. Appreciate all the great questions from the participants who are taking their time in August to listen to this. So thank you. We do have, for those of you who are in New York and our members, our next briefing is in person, and it's with the UK Consul General, Hannah Young, who also spent time in Afghanistan. So we do encourage people to come to that. And then we're also doing one on critical minerals and the race for deep sea mining that's coming up. And we are a nonprofit, and we do encourage people to donate to support this work or join to become members. So thank you, Masuda, Carter. A great pleasure to be with you as always. Really appreciate it. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.